Let's start. MTC 202137-018. I'm Maggie Morgan, a longtime fan of the Wakefield Community Theatre. I'm well aware that in this difficult economy, organizations such as the Wakefield Community Theatre are facing financial difficulties and therefore an increase in ticket prices is inevitable. Wakefield Community Theatre. But in my opinion, a 50% increase to the price of individual tickets seems totally unreasonable. 50. It would mean that ordinary residents like myself will have fewer opportunities to enjoy a quality drama performance. Pricing tickets out of the range of low cost, it'll hurt your organization in years to come. I'm sure there will be other ways to get financial support instead of raising ticket prices so much. I hope to hear from you soon on this matter. MTC. Good job. Let's start. 202137-019. Tavel feels he understands this buried world and he is ready to leave. Tavel. But when he turns, the hole he'd climbed through no longer exists. In its place is a smooth wall of white tile, a continuation of the unending pattern throughout the tunnel. The broken scraps of debris that had littered the base of the hole are gone as well. And this is when he feels the horrifying truth of where he is, so deep underground that the climb down may be brutally so. He claws at the tiles. He screams, not caring if someone hears, hoping they do and will cast him out. MTC. Good job. Let's start. TC 202137. Your brain doesn't recognize don't. No matter what I say, don't think of a giraffe with brown spots on it. No matter what I say, don't think of a clear glass vase with fresh red roses in it. What happens? It's automatic, isn't it? Your brain goes ahead and creates the picture all by itself. Your words, whether you think, say, read, or hear them, are a direct command to create. The more direct the order, the more diligent the response. Trickily, if you say you don't want to lose your temper, your brain doesn't recognize don't and sees it as a royal command to get you to lose your temper. If say you don't want to spill your drink, it's as good as an instruction to tip the contents. Change your words to support you. Create affirmations that suit you. Think and say precisely what you desire rather than what you don't want. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-021. Perhaps the most puzzling aspect of innovation is how unpopular it is, for all the lip service we pay to it. Despite the abundant evidence that it has transformed almost everybody's lives for the better in innumerable ways, the knee-jerk reaction of most people to something new is far more than the good ones. And we throw obstacles in the way of innovators, on behalf of those with a vested interest in the status quo, investors, managers, and employees alike. History shows that innovation is a delicate and vulnerable flower, easily crushed underfoot, but quick to regrow if conditions allow. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-022. The immense improvement in the yield of farming during the 20th century, as a result of innovations in mechanization, fertilizer, new varieties, pesticides, and genetic engineering, has banished famine from the face of the planet almost entirely, and drastically reduced malnutrition, even while the human population has continued to expand. 20. Few predicted this, yet many are concerned that this improvement has come at the expense of nature. In fact, the evidence is strong that the opposite is the case. Innovation in food production has spared land and forest from the plow, the cow, and the axe on a grand scale by increasing the productivity of the land we do farm. It turns out that this land sparing has been much better for biodiversity than land sharing would have been, by which is meant growing crops at low yields in the hope that abundant wildlife lives in fields alongside crops. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-023. More recently there have been attempts to argue that unpaid work is work because it is an activity that combines labor with raw materials to produce goods and services with enhanced economic value. Economists such as Duncan Ironmonger have attempted to impute a dollar value on volunteering to enable its economic value to be counted. Duncan Ironmonger. Yet despite this, unpaid work and volunteering still remain outside the defined economic framework of our capitalist system because capitalism has competition and financial reward as its cornerstones and volunteering does not. Having said that, it has been estimated that volunteering contributes about $42 billion a year to the Australian economy. 420. Although attempts to quantify and qualify the financial importance of volunteering in supporting our economic structures and enhancing our social capital continue to be made, it is slow going. And while volunteering remains outside the GDP, its true value and importance is neglected. GDP. Governments continue to pay lip service to the importance of volunteering but ultimately deny it official recognition. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-024. Amazingly, many businesses evaluate their customer service strategy by the number of complaints they get. We have very few complaints from our customers, so we don't need customer service training at the moment. I am told this regularly when prospecting for new clients. Either that or, the number of complaints has dramatically decreased this year and we are very pleased. It seems our customer service initiatives are working. Companies using this type of measure are in denial. Although it is tempting to bury your head in the sand and believe no news is good news, trust me, if customers are not complaining to you, then they are complaining to other people or they are just never using your business again. The concerning thing is that customers who don't complain there and then increasingly post their views on the internet and through the social networking sites, they are no longer telling 9 or so people but are probably telling thousands. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-026. Waldemar Hafkine was born on 16 March 1860 at Odessa in Russia. Waldemar Hafkine 1860316 Odessa. He graduated in the Science Faculty of Odessa University in 1884. 1884 Odessa. In 1889, Hafkine went to Paris to work at the Pasteur Institute, and did research to prepare a vaccine against cholera. 1889 Hafkine Pasteur Institute. His initial work on developing a cholera vaccine was successful. After a series of animal trials, in 1892 he tested the cholera vaccine on himself, risking his own life. 1892. During the Indian cholera epidemic of 1893, at the invitation of the Government of India he went to Calcutta and introduced his vaccine. 1893, Calcutta. After initial criticism by the local medical bodies, it was widely accepted. Hafkine was appointed as the director of the plague laboratory in Bombay, now called the Hafkine Institute. Hafkine Institute, Bombay Plague Laboratory. After his retirement in 1914, he returned to France and occasionally wrote for medical journals. 1914. He revisited Odessa in 1927, but could not adapt to the tremendous changes after the revolution in the country of his birth. 1927 Odessa. He moved to Switzerland in 1928 and remained there for the last 2 years of his life. 19282. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-029. The idea that people selectively expose themselves to news content has been around for a long time, but it is even more important today with the fragmentation of audiences and the proliferation of choices. Selective exposure is a psychological concept that says people seek out information that conforms to their existing belief systems and avoid information that challenges those beliefs. In the past, when there were few sources of news, people could either expose themselves to mainstream news where they would likely see beliefs expressed counter to their own, or they could avoid news altogether. Now, with so many types of news constantly available to a full range of niche audiences, people can easily find a source of news that consistently confirms their own personal set of beliefs. This leads to the possibility of creating many different small groups of people, with each strongly believing they are correct and everyone else is wrong about how the world works. MTC. Good job. Start. MTC 202137-030. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the quantity of freight transported between nations was negligible by contemporary standards. For instance, during the Middle Ages, the totality of French imports via the St. Gothard Passage would not fill a freight train. St. Gothard Passage. The amount of freight transported by the Venetian fleet, which dominated Mediterranean trade, would not fill a modern container ship. The volume, but not the speed, of trade improved under mercantilism, notably for maritime transportation. In spite of all, distribution capacities were very limited and speeds slow. For example, a stagecoach going through the English countryside in the 16th century had an average speed of 2 miles per hour. 162. Moving 1 ton of cargo 30 miles inland in the United States by the late 18th century was as costly as moving it across the Atlantic. 18130. The inland transportation system was thus very limited. By the late 18th century, canal systems started to emerge in Europe. 18. They permitted the large movements of bulk freight inland and expanded regional trade. Maritime and riverine transportation were consequently the dominant modes of the pre-industrial era. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-031. Relatively undeveloped languages have no single word for plants. The lack of a term doesn't mean they don't perceive differences, and it doesn't mean they don't know the difference between spinach and a cactus. Lack an all-encompassing term with which to refer to plants. We see cases like this in our own language. For example, English lacks a single basic term to refer to edible mushrooms. We also lack a term for all the people you would have to notify if you were going into the hospital for 3 weeks. 3. These might include close relatives, friends, your employer, the newspaper delivery person, and anyone you had appointments with during that period. The lack of a term doesn't mean you don't understand the concept. It simply means that the category isn't reflected in our language. This could be because a need for it hasn't been so pressing that a word needed to be coined. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-032. Psychologists and neuroscientists warn that when we rely on technology to perform tasks such as navigation for us, our awareness of our physical environment fades as we become immersed instead in an abstract, computerized world. Studies show that we tend to place too much faith in the accuracy of information from computer monitors, and to ignore or discount information from our own eyes and ears, an effect that has caused pilots to crash planes and GPS following tourists to drive into the sea. GPS A team led by the British neuroscientist Hugo Spears found in 2017 that areas of the brain normally involved in navigation just don't engage when people use GPS. Hugo Spears GPS 2017. When we have technology telling us which way to go, said Spears, these parts of the brain simply don't respond to the street network. In that sense, our brain has switched off its interest in the streets around us. Spears. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-033. The conventional view of what the state should do to foster innovation is simple: it just needs to get out of the way. At best, governments merely facilitate the economic dynamism of the private sector. At worst, their lumbering, heavy-handed, and bureaucratic institutions actively inhibit it. The fast-moving, risk-loving, and pioneering private sector, by contrast, is what really drives the type of innovation that creates economic growth. According to this view, the secret behind Silicon Valley lies in its entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. The state can intervene in the economy, but only to fix market failures or level the playing field. It can regulate the private sector in order to account for the external costs companies may impose on the public, such as pollution, and it can invest in public goods, such as basic scientific research or the development of drugs with little market potential. It should not, however, directly attempt to create and shape markets. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-034. The designer in the age of algorithms poses a threat to American jurisprudence because the algorithm is only as good as the designer's understanding of the intended use of the algorithm. The person designing the algorithm may be an excellent software engineer, but without the knowledge of all the factors that need to go into an algorithmic process, the engineer could unknowingly produce an algorithm whose decisions are at best incomplete and at worst discriminatory and unfair. Compounding the problem, an algorithm design firm might be under contract to design algorithms for a wide range of uses, from determining which patients awaiting transplants are chosen to receive organs, to which criminals facing sentencing should be given probation or the maximum sentence. That firm is not going to be staffed with subject matter experts who know what questions each algorithm needs to address, what databases the algorithm should use to collect its data, and what pitfalls the algorithm needs to avoid in churning out decisions. MTC. Good job. MTC 202137-035. While we believe we hold the power to raise our children, the reality is that our children hold the power to raise us into the parents they need us to become. For this reason, the parenting experience isn't one of parent versus child but of parent with child. The road to wholeness sits in our children's lap, and all we need do is take a seat. As our children show us our way back to our own essence, they become our greatest awakeners. If we fail to hold their hand and follow their lead as they guide us through the gateway of increased consciousness, we lose the chance to walk toward our own enlightenment. MTC. Good job. Start. MTC 202137-036. Regression fallacy is a mistake of causal reasoning due to the failure to consider how things fluctuate randomly, typically around some average condition. Intense pain, exceptional sports performance, and high stock prices are likely to be followed by more subdued conditions eventually due to natural fluctuation. Failure to recognize this fact can lead to wrong conclusions about causation. For example, someone might suffer from back pain now and then, but nothing seems to solve the problem completely. During a period of very intense pain, the patient decided to try alternative therapy like putting a magnetic patch on his back. He felt less pain afterward and concluded that the patch worked. But this could just be the result of regression. If he sought treatment when the pain was very intense, it is quite possible that the pain has already reached its peak and would lessen in any case as part of the natural cycle. Inferring that the patch was effective ignored a relevant alternative explanation. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-037. There was a moment in research history when scientists wondered if the measure of choice total minutes of sleep was the wrong way of looking at the question of why sleep varies so considerably across species. Instead, they suspected that assessing sleep quality, rather than quantity, time, would shed some light on the mystery. That is, species with superior quality of sleep should be able to accomplish all they need in a shorter time, and vice versa. It was a great idea, with the exception that, if anything, we've discovered the opposite relationship: those that sleep more have deeper, higher quality sleep. In truth, the way quality is commonly assessed in these investigations, degree of unresponsiveness to the outside world and the continuity of sleep, is probably a poor index of the real biological measure of sleep quality, one that we cannot yet obtain in all these species. When we can, our understanding of the relationship between sleep quantity and quality across the animal kingdom will likely explain what currently appears to be an incomprehensible map of sleep time differences. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-038. Why does the skin on the extremities wrinkle after a bath? And why only the extremities? Despite its appearance, your skin isn't shrinking after your bath. Actually, it is expanding. The skin on the fingers, palms, toes, and soles wrinkles only after it is soaked with water. The stratum corneum, the thick, dead, rough layer of the skin that protects us from the environment and that makes the skin on our hands and feet tougher and thicker than that on our stomachs or faces, expands when it soaks up water. This expansion causes the wrinkling effect. So why doesn't the skin on other parts of the body also wrinkle when soaked? Actually, it does, but there is more room for the moisture to be absorbed in these less densely packed areas before it shows. One doctor we contacted said that soldiers whose feet are submerged in wet boots for a long period will exhibit wrinkling all over the covered area. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-039. Whenever you perform a specific action, say, throwing a ball, your brain fires off in a very specific pattern. Interestingly, whenever you imagine yourself performing this same action, your brain fires off in almost the same pattern. This is why mental rehearsal is such a prominent technique in sports training. The brain doesn't draw a strict distinction between the real and the imagined. Here's the best bit: whenever you hear a story about a person performing this same action, throwing a ball, your brain will fire off in almost the same pattern. This doesn't happen when you encounter this action in isolation: the man threw the ball. But as soon as it's embedded within a narrative, your brain will respond largely as though you were performing the action. This means we do not simply listen to stories, we experience stories. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-040. A basic principle in economics is that when the supply of something goes up, its price should go down. The puzzle was that in the 20th century, there were prolonged periods where the reverse appeared to happen in the world of work. 20. In some countries, there was huge growth in the number of high-skilled people pouring out of colleges and universities, yet their wages appeared to rise rather than fall compared to those without this education. How could this be? The supply of high-skilled workers did grow, pushing their wages downward, but new technologies were skill-biased and so caused the demand for high-skilled workers to soar. The latter effect was so great that it overcame the former, so even though there were more educated people looking for work, the demand for them was so strong that the amount they were paid still went up. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-04142. There is something about a printed photograph or newspaper headline that makes the event it describes more real than in any other form of news reporting. Perhaps this is because there is an undeniable reality to the newspaper itself, it is a real material object. That authenticity rubs off on the news. It can be pointed to, underlined, cut out, pinned on notice boards, stuck in a scrapbook, or archived in libraries. The news becomes an artifact, frozen in time. The event may be long gone, but it lives on as an indisputable fact because of its material presence even if it is untrue. In contrast, news websites seem short-lived. Although they too are archived, there is no unique physical component to point to as evidence of the information they convey. For this reason, there is a sense in which they can be more easily manipulated, and that history itself could be altered. At the same time, it is precisely this immediacy and variability of content that makes the digital media so exciting. The news website is in tune with an age that sees history as much less monolithic than previous eras once did. Digital news websites are potentially much more democratic, too, for while a physical newspaper requires huge printing presses and a distribution network linking trains, planes, trucks, shops, and ultimately newspaper sellers, in the digital world a single person can communicate with the whole world with the aid of a single computer and without requiring a single tree to be cut down. TC. Good job. Let's start. MTC 202137-04345. Gale Sayers was one of the best running backs the Chicago Bears ever had. Gale Sayers, Chicago Bears. He was black. In 1967, Sayers' teammate in the backfield was another great running back by the name of Brian Piccolo. 1967 Sayers, Brian Piccolo. Piccolo was white. Piccolo. Blacks and whites often played on the same professional teams, but these two athletes were different. They were roommates on away games, which was a first for race relations in professional football. Sayers had never had a close relationship with any white man before, except with George Halas, the head coach of the Bears. Sayers bears George Halas. And Piccolo admitted that he had never really known a black person during his lifetime. Piccolo. These two athletes became friends immediately and grew exceptionally close. During the 1969 season, Brian Piccolo was diagnosed as having cancer. 1969 Brian Piccolo. Although he fought to play out the season, Piccolo was in the hospital more than he was on the playing field. Piccolo. It was during this time when Piccolo was battling his illness and fighting the daily depths of depression, that these two athletes shared a very special relationship. Piccolo. Frequently, Sayers flew to be at the bedside of his friend, as the cancer gripped Piccolo's weakened body tighter and tighter. Sayers Piccolo. Sayers and Piccolo, and their wives, had made plans to sit together at the annual Professional Football Writers' Banquet in New York, where Gale Sayers was to receive the George S. Halas Award as the most courageous player in professional football. Sayers Piccolo Professional Football Writers' Banquet, Gale Sayers George S. Halas. By the time of the banquet, Piccolo was too sick to attend. Piccolo. When Sayers stood to receive his award at the banquet, tears began to flow. Sayers, choking through his tears, said, "You flatter me by giving me this award, but I tell you that I accept this award not for me, but for Brian Piccolo." Sayers, Brian Piccolo. However, Brian cannot be here tonight. Brian. He is too ill. But he is a man who has more courage than any of us here tonight. Shortly after that memorable night, Brian Piccolo died. Brian Piccolo. His memory will forever be etched in the heart of Gale Sayers. Gale Sayers. Piccolo and Sayers had cultivated more than a superficial, tough guy relationship. Piccolo Sayers. Although tough and competitive men to the core, a true and caring love had developed between these two strong athletes. MTC. Good job.